You've just heard Henry Hall's Gala Guest Night, a BBC starred programme celebrating 10 years of these Henry Hall broadcasts. And now we'd like you to stand by for a piece of news that's just come in.
This is the BBC Home Service. Before we go on to the next part of the programme, here's another piece of good news. The Allies have now crossed the Dutch frontier. The announcement has been made by the Netherlands Prime Minister in a broadcast to his countrymen calling on them to welcome the forces of liberation. He didn't say where the crossing had been made. The British Second Army closing on Antwerp was last reported less than 20 miles from the border.
This is the BBC Home Service. Before continuing our programs, here is a special announcement. Reports have come in from British Second Army headquarters this morning with the good news that we are in Brussels. Our armored cars reached the capital yesterday afternoon, and British troops have been given a great welcome from our Belgian allies. As a tribute to them, we are playing their national anthem.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news read by Stuart Hibbard. Mr. Churchill has arrived in Quebec. American troops are reported to have entered the city of Luxemburg. Others beyond Liège are within 10 miles of Aachen in Germany. And to the northwest, they have reached the line of the Albert Canal at Hasselt. The British Second Army along the Albert Canal are still meeting very stiff resistance. The Canadians have reached the Channel coast between Calais and Boulogne and have also got to Zeebrugge and Blankenberg. Home-based Lancasters of Bomber Command, in 2 attacks today, have dropped nearly 5,000 tons on the Germans still in Havre. Over 1,000 American heavy bombers have also been out today attacking targets in southern Germany. The Fifth Army in Italy have reached the outposts of the Gothic Line west of Florence, and the Eighth have made progress to the north of it. On the Adriatic sector, fighting is very violent, and more ground has been won. The Russians have made further progress in their approach over the mountains towards Hungarian-occupied Transylvania and in the southern tip of the territory. Correspondents with the American First Army report this evening that Allied troops have entered the city of Luxemburg, capital of the Grand Duchy. For the second time in 30 years, the people of Luxemburg have been liberated from the invading Germans. We now salute the smallest of our allies.
I want today, the 17th of September, to speak to all soldiers in the group of armies under my command. What a change has come over the scene since I last spoke to you on the 21st of August. Then we were moving up towards the Seine, having inflicted a decisive defeat on the German armies in Normandy. Today, the Seine is far behind us. The Allies have removed the enemy from practically the whole of France and Belgium, except in a few places, and we stand at the door of Germany. We have advanced a great way in a short time, and we have accomplished much. The enemy has suffered immense losses in men and material. It is becoming problematical how much longer he can continue the struggle. Such a historic march of events can seldom have taken place in history in such a short space of time. You have every reason to be very proud of what you have done. Let us say to each other, this was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes.
About 2 hours ago, Supreme Headquarters gave the news of our airborne landing in Holland in this brief announcement. Strong forces of the 1st Allied Airborne Army were landed in Holland this afternoon. That's all the official news so far. The Germans say that landings were made by paratroops followed by gliders at 3 places in the southern part of Holland. Near Nijmegen, that's spelled Nijwegen, just by the German frontier, where the Rhine enters Dutch territory, and in the area of Eindhoven and Tilburg. about 35 miles to the southwest and some 10 miles from the Belgian frontier. A special message from General Eisenhower's headquarters was broadcast this afternoon to the people in this southern part of Holland, bounded by the great waterways of the Rhine, which reach the sea in the Rotterdam area. They were called on for a last supreme effort to help the Allied troops in liberating the Netherlands. And the forces of resistance under Prince Bernhard were given detailed instructions for operations under the rules of war. They were asked, for instance, no longer to sabotage, but to protect places like factories and mines, and particularly to prevent the enemy destroying petrol and oil stores. Before the airborne landings, something like 1,000 escorted flying fortresses bombed German gun positions in Holland this morning, and the country's airfields had been pounded by Bomber Command Lancasters during the night. Many people in England watched our terrific air fleets on their way to Holland with gliders in tow, a good sight on the Sunday that commemorates the Battle of Britain 4 years ago. It's the first operation since the British and American airborne forces were combined in one command last month. When that happened, General Eisenhower said to the airborne troops, "Through your effective employment, we will end this war far more quickly than we could without you."
We've been flying straight into Holland now for something like 20 minutes. So far, without any opposition, at least none that I have been able to see. Our fighters are down just almost nosing along the hedgerows, searching the little villages, and they're up above us and on both sides. This is the real meaning of air power, and it seems that the Dutch realize it as well, because in a little village that we're just passing over, I can see at least 24 people standing along the narrow winding street. Some of them are children, and I can see that most of them seem to be wearing a white shirt or a white blouse of some kind. There go the Paratroops on a formation ahead of us, yellow, brown, red, drifting down gently, dropping their containers. I can't see, we're a little too far away, I can't see the bodies of the men. Yes, I can. Just like little brown dolls hanging under a green lampshade, they look. Look back at the door, and Lieutenant Haupt gives me the clenched hand salute like a boxer about to jump.
We're just ready to jump now.
Our particular group is not yet dropped. The chutes ahead of us are still going on. There's a burst of flak right there. Those are coming up on us now. You can see it red from the side. It's coming from the port side, just across our nose, but a little bit low, at least so it seems so far. I think it's coming from a railway embankment just down to the left. It was certainly considerably under us and just ahead of us then. It's the first flak we've seen. There was one burst of light flak, there's another. More tracers going across just in front of our nose. I think it's coming from that little village just beside the canal. More tracer coming up now, just cutting across in front of our nose. A lovely orange color it is. More ships ahead of us are now dropping. Haupt will be just teed up on the door now, waiting to jump. Walking out of this aircraft with no flak suits, no armor plating on the ship. We're down just about to the drop altitude now. A little more tracer coming up. The 9 ships ahead of us have just dropped. You can see the men swinging down. In just about 30 seconds now, our ship will drop, and these 19 men will walk out onto Dutch soil. You can probably hear the snap as they check the lashing on the static line. We're throttled back now. There it goes. Do you hear them shout? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. There they go. Every man out. I can see their chutes going down now. Every man clear. They're dropping just beside a little windmill near a church, hanging there very gracefully. Seem to be completely relaxed, as I said a moment ago, like nothing so much as khaki dolls hanging beneath a green lampshade. You can see one man go down just north of the little road. The whole sky is filled with parachutes. They're all going down so slowly, it seems as though they should get to the ground much faster. We're now swinging about, making a right-hand turn.
When we went over on Sunday, we were the first aircraft of the whole operation. There was no opposition at all. In fact, I told a pressman afterwards that I thought Jerry had had it.
Every time a Jerry gun opened up on the ground, there were about 4 Spitfires dived down and blew it to bits. We dropped Pathfinders that first day.
Behind us, there was a continual stream of gliders. It stretched for over 120 miles. All these were converging in 2 streams on the dropping zone. It would be about 1.5 miles long, I should say, by 1 mile wide.
About the area of Wembley Stadium. And with these aircraft, our timing had to be correct within 10 seconds. We did it all right, though. The coastline had been altered because Jerry had flooded it, and whole villages were underwater. He had done this flooding so thoroughly that some of his own flak positions were underwater, too.
Next day, Jerry had definitely wakened up to the fact that there was an invasion on. He was firing at us as we crossed the Dutch coast, flak along the whole route, and he also had guns along the river. One thing I remember, as we went in, there was a ship in the estuary. I don't know much about shipping, but I'd say it was about 10,000 tons. That opened up at us, but 4 typhoons went in. When we came out, we saw the ship again. It was just a charred wreck. We knew the boys down there would be hard up for news, so before we set out, we collected all the newspapers we could from the mess and dropped them for the chaps below. I'd like to say one thing about the glider pilots. We were towing a glider, and as we set off, the pilot reported he had difficulty in keeping his left wing down. Both he and his second pilot had to hang on to the stick together to keep the craft steady. We asked him if he'd like to be cast off at base. He said no, they'd carry on, and they did. It's no easy job in any case handling a glider when the towing aircraft is dodging flak. They got down all right, though. Another pilot called up the pilot of the towing plane as he cast off and said thanks for the trip. A nice gesture, I thought.
Next day, Tuesday, Jerry really started to put flak in. Between the last turning point and the dropping zone, they had about 4 batteries. This was a trip with supplies. Jerry had light flak close to the DZ and heavy flak from a good way off. There was no sort of pattern about it.
It was not like bombing a large town where you can weave in and out of it. Jerry knew we had to go to that place, and they had it taped.
Nothing you could do about it. Just as safe to fly straight and level and hope to get out of it. It seemed impossible. It was like neon signs flashing all around. Just a bowl of flak. There was heavy fighting below. We could spot mortar fire, but I couldn't tell you what was going on. We really didn't stop to look.
That was the first night I saw any real anxiety in the mess. The boys who got back went straight to the mess for a drink. Then they were ringing up control tower, asking, is so-and-so back? It was the first day we'd had any real losses.
Wednesday. That day the flak got definitely worse.
I saw 5 kites go down in 2 minutes. There were others burning on the ground that we hadn't seen go down. Visibility was 0 that day. As kites were being shot down, you'd hear your bomb aimer say, there goes Q Queenie, and so on.
And as I turned away from the DZ, I got mine. I was hit twice in the tailplane. I went into a steep dive, but regained control about 400 feet. I was really shaken. I gave the order to prepare to abandon aircraft. Then I figured with some help I could keep the aircraft flying, so I called my bomb aimer up. We both fought with the controls together, but as we neared the Belgian coast, I figured we couldn't keep control long enough to reach England, so I decided to crash land. I asked the bomb aimer if he'd help me bring her in, and told the crew they could bail out if they wanted. But my wireless operator, he'd got some shrapnel in the shoulder. He said he'd rather stay with the aircraft. Then the engineer came up and said, we'll stay with her, Skip. We picked out a field and came down. It was a successful belly landing. We got the radio operator into the military hospital, and we stayed the night, then on to Brussels. The people were grand and gave us a great time.
Just a few minutes ago, the fighter cover showed up, and right behind them came those lovely supply planes which you can hear up above us now. Yesterday and this morning, our supplies came, and they were dropped in the wrong place. The enemy got them. But now these planes have come over, and they've dropped them right dead over us. Everybody is cheering and clapping, and they just can't give vent to their feelings about what a wonderful sight this is. All these bundles and parachuted packages and ammunition are coming down here all around us, through the trees, bouncing on the ground. The men are running out to get them, and you have no idea what this means to us to see this ammunition and this food coming down here where the men can get it. They're such fighters that if they can only get the stuff to fight with, it's a wonderful thing. Shame. It's a shame when they can't get the stuff to fight with. You can hear the kind of flak that those planes are flying through. It's absolutely like hail up there. These enemy guns all around us are just simply hammering at those planes. But so far I haven't seen any of them hit. But the bundles are coming down. The parachutes are coming down. That's all that these men ask.
About 5 kilometers to the west of Arnhem, in a space 1,500 yards by 900 on that last day, I saw the dead and the living. Those who fought a good fight and kept the faith with you at home, and those who still fought magnificently on. They were the last of the few. I last saw them yesterday morning as they dribbled into Nijmegen. They had staggered and walked and waited all night from Arnhem, about 10 miles north, and we were busy asking each other if this or that one had been seen. Everyone wondered what the final checkup would amount to. I walked up to one young lieutenant to ask him about his sergeant, a stout lad if there ever was one, and he started to explain what had happened and then turned away. Remember, all of these men had been practically 10 days and 10 nights under the most murderous concentrated fire I've seen in 2 wars. Then he turned again and said, "It's hell to be pulled out when you haven't finished your job, isn't it?" That's the way they all felt. It doesn't occur to them that if they hadn't held that horde of enemy force at Arnhem, that force would have been down at Nijmegen, upsetting the whole apple cart. That was yesterday morning. Late on the afternoon before, we were told that the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division were going to pull out that night. The enemy was making it impossible for the elements of the 2nd Army to relieve us. BBC's Guy Byam, Alan Woods of the Daily Express, and I were told by Major Roy Oliver of the Public Relations Division, who incidentally proved himself a great soldier as well, we were told to destroy all our equipment with the exception of what would go into one haversack. We were told to muffle our boots with bits of blanket and be ready to move off at a certain time. When the various officers were told to transmit this news to that thin straggle of hard-pressed men around the pitifully small perimeter, a great silence seemed to come upon them, even in the middle of the shelling. You see, day or night, the shelling and mortaring never stopped. The ones I saw just drew a deep breath and said, "Very good, sir." Then those staring eyes in the middle of black muddy masks saluted as they always would, and faded away to crawl out on their stomachs and tell their men. Perhaps I should remind you here that these were men of no ordinary caliber. They'd been 9 days in that little space I mentioned, being mortared and shelled, machine-gunned and sniped from all around. When a tank or a self-propelled 88 gun broke through, 2 or 3 of them detached themselves and somehow or another had put it out of business. For the last 3 days they had had no water, very little but small arms ammunition, and rations cut to 1/6. Luckily or unluckily, it rained, and they caught the water in their capes and drank that. These last items were never mentioned. They were airborne, weren't they? They were tough and knew it. All right, water and rations didn't matter. Give them some Germans to kill, and even 1 chance in 10, and they'd get along somehow. Well, at 2 minutes past 10, we clambered out of our slit trenches in an absolute din of bombardment, a great deal of it our own, and formed up in a single line. Our boots were wrapped in blankets so that no noise would be made. We held the tail of the coat of the man in front. We set off like a file of nebulous ghosts from our pockmarked and tree-strewn piece of ground. Obviously, since the enemy was all round us, we had to go through him to get to the River Rhine. After about 200 yards of silent trekking, we knew we were among the enemy. It was difficult not to throw yourself flat when machine gun tracers skimmed your head, or the scream of a shell or mortar bomb sounded very close. But the orders were to keep going. Anybody hit was to be picked up by the man behind him. Major Oliver had reconnoitered the route earlier on with a headquarters officer and had it memorized. The back of my neck was prickling for that whole interminable march. I couldn't see the man ahead of me. All I knew was that I had hold of a coat-tail, and for the first time in my life was grateful for the downpour of rain that made a patter on the leaves of the trees and covered up any little noises we were making. At every turn of the way, there was posted a sergeant glider pilot who stepped out like a shadow and then stepped back into a deeper shadow again. Several times we halted, which meant you bumped into the man ahead of you. Then, when the head of our party was satisfied, the turning was clear, we went on again. Once we halted because of a boy sitting on the ground with a bullet through his leg. We wanted to pick him up, but he whispered, "Knock it, give me another field dressing and I'll be all right. I can walk." As we came out of the trees, we'd been following carefully thought-out footpaths so far, I felt as naked as if I were in Piccadilly Circus in my pajamas, because of the glow from fires across the river. The machine gun and general bombardment had never let up. We lay down flat in the mud and rain and stayed that way for 2 hours, till the sentry beyond the hedge on the bank of the river told us to move up over the dike and be taken across. Mortaring started now, and I was fearful for those that were already over on the bank. I guess it was pretty bad for them. After what seemed a nightmare of an age, we got our turn and slithered up and over onto some mud flats. There was the shadow of a little assault craft with an outboard motor on it. Several of these had been rushed up by a field company of engineers. 1 or 2 of them were out of action already. We waded out into the Rhine, up to our hips. It didn't matter. I was soaked through long ago, had been for days. And a voice that was sheer music spoke up from the stern of the boat, saying, "You'll have to step lively, boys. 'Tain't healthy here." It was a Canadian voice, and the engineers were Canadian engineers. We helped push the boat off into the swift Rhine current, and with our heads down between our knees, waited for the bump on the far side, or for what might come before. It didn't come. We clambered out and followed what had been a white tape up over a dike. We slid down the other side on our backsides, and we sloshed through mud for 4.5 miles, me thinking, gosh, I'm alive. How did it happen? In a barn, there was a blessed hot mug of tea with rum in it and a blanket over our shoulders, and then we walked again all night. After daylight, we got to a dressing station near Nijmegen, and then we were put in trucks, and that's how we reached Nijmegen. That's how the last of the few got out to go in and fight in some future battle. And no matter what battle that is, I know they won't let you down.
You have been listening to Sound Pictures from Europe, a program assembled in England by the London Transcription Service of the British Broadcasting Corporation.
As everybody knows by now, the task of the 1st Airborne Division was to capture and hold the bridge at Arnhem and establish a firm bridgehead round the town so that the Second Army, with its armour, would have a clear passage northwards from Nijmegen over the River Lek. The flight and landing itself could not have been better, but there are two factors which I must mention which had a major influence on the subsequent operations. The first, that owing to the flak defences and the nature of the ground, the dropping zones available were some 8 miles from the town. And this meant that by the time our forces had fought their way from the dropping zone to the town, the element of surprise was no longer there. The second factor is that owing to the requirement for the airborne forces at Grave and Newmagen, it was necessary to split my division into 2 lifts, the second lift dropping on the second day. This was necessary when you consider the bigger picture, for it was obviously essential that priority be given to the Americans in order to seize the bridges at Grave and Newmagen. I should like to pay a tribute to the excellent start which was given to us by the RAF and the American Troop Carrier Command. All the parachutists which were carried by American aircraft and the gliders which were towed by British aircraft were dropped and landed in exactly the right place, in a fashion which has never been even approached in previous practice. The glider pilots who brought us in, too, were quite first class, and they later had much more than their share of fighting during the following days. You may know that an airborne division is not built to fight by itself for more than a limited period, and also in face of strong opposition. We had hoped to join up the Second Army in 3 to 4 days at the latest, and as things worked out, except for limited reinforcements across the river, we were by ourselves for 9 days. As you know now, 1 battalion did get on to the main road bridge at Arnhem, and they held the approaches to that bridge for the best part of 3 days. That story and the tale of the operations which followed have already been well told, and you now know that eventually what remained of the division was forced into a comparatively small perimeter for the better part of the last 5 days. During that period we were constantly under pretty heavy shell and mortar fire, and every day brought its quota of attacks by infantry and tanks and self-propelled guns. Snipers during this period were particularly annoying, and they caused a lot of casualties. The men, however, were absolutely magnificent, and those that had not been in battle before soon settled down to it like old stagers. And for the last few days they were pretty short of water and on very short rations. The RAF could not have done more in their efforts to resupply us. The flak round the area was very heavy, but in spite of this, the pilots flew right into it time and time again, and it was not their fault that a great many of the containers fell outside our lines. Some of the aircraft who failed to reach us the first time even flew round and had another go. It was magnificent. When weather permitted their support, we got typhoons and thunderbolts, and these gave us tremendous assistance. Their rockets did great damage and not only frightened the Germans, but it also cheered our fellows no end. We had a lot of wounded, and unfortunately we had to leave them behind. But our doctors stayed with them, and they are receiving every attention. A word about the gunners. They had a sticky time. Our anti-tank guns were knocked out one by one, but even so we claim a bag of about 25 tanks and self-propelled guns. The one gunner regiment had a particularly thin time when 2 tanks got into their area, and this had unfortunate results. The gunners and the artillery of the Second Army gave us very, very valuable assistance, both during the battle and withdrawal. And we can say that without this, it would not have been possible for us to have lasted as long as we did. The withdrawal from the Arnhem area was very well timed, for I don't think that we could have held out for another 24 hours. The arrangements made by the division on the south bank were first class, and so the results of the withdrawal were very much better than I dared to hope. Ferrying started about 10 p.m. in small boats, some with outboard motors, and manned partly by Canadian engineers. Constant artillery and machine gun support covered our withdrawal. And all but a few hundred of those who were in the perimeter got away, in spite of the fact that the Hun was holding positions well within that area. As I said before, the men did magnificent. The airborne troops regard themselves as belonging to a corps d'elite. The parachutists are all volunteers, and the glider-borne elements of the division are all hand-picked. We expect a high standard, and I think I can say without exaggeration that they well exceeded that standard. I feel extremely proud to have commanded them in battle.
This is A.E. Powley of the CBC, reporting from Holland. The South Beveland cleanup meant bitter fighting for the Canadians to the last yard. Or perhaps that should be to the extra 1,000 yards, the length of the causeway that joins South Beveland to Walcheren. While British commandos and infantry were landing on Walcheren from the sea, at Flushing and West Capelle, Canadian troops were winning a third bridgehead, a perilous toehold on Walcheren's eastern dikes. They got there along the causeway, and getting there was one of the grimmest jobs of the whole Scheldt operation. The causeway carries 2 railway lines and a road 60 feet wide. Its whole length was commanded by enemy fire, but still the infantry started along it. They started under fire from big guns, heavy machine guns, and mortars. There was no room for deployment. The only way they could move was straight ahead. Somehow, during the night, they got within 25 yards of the Walcheren end, but they were pinned there. At that end, the Germans had blown a huge crater 10 feet deep and the full width of the roadway, so there was no chance of getting armored vehicles or even carriers across. Men were being wounded and killed by the fire that the Germans concentrated on the head of the causeway, and at last the attack had to be pulled back. But another went in, and this time the infantry cleared the last 25 yards, reached the dikes and overran the nearer machine gun posts to make the beginning of an eastern bridgehead on Walcheren. It was a bloody but appropriate finale to the Beveland battles. After fighting hard and sometimes desperately along the neck and back into the island, the Germans retreated fast after the Canadians stormed the canal that cuts the island in a north and south line. Apparently, they thought they could hold along the canal, or at any rate, bog down our advance by dynamiting the banks and flooding the countryside. But the attack on the canal took them by surprise, and from there on they retreated fast. They had a sting in their tail, though. They mined the island's one highway thoroughly, and the mines cost Canadian vehicles and lives. They left rear guards with machine guns and field guns. The rear guards didn't fight to the death, but they fired down the roads into the attack till they were in danger of being overrun, and then ran for it. The German gunners simply left their guns behind to be captured, and by Tuesday, all the Germans who hadn't been killed or captured on Beveland were away across the causeway. Looking over the country, it's hard to understand how they could have been disposed of as quickly as they were. Their brick and concrete strongpoints were built right into the dikes. Their slit trenches were luxurious as slit trenches go, brick-lined and dry. They had explosive charges wired to the trees along the roadsides to fell them across the road for tank blocks. They generally had the advantage of observed artillery fire. In fact, the whole configuration of the country seemed to be in their favor. But by today, they'd been pushed back behind the strong points on Walcheren for a brief and uneasy tenure.
Hello, BBC. This is Frank Gillard with the British Second Army. Down in the German border country, I've been talking today to troops of a British Yeomanry regiment, an armoured formation equipped with Sherman tanks, who've been right up in the thick of the first battle fought by the Second Army on German soil, and who engaged the enemy for 6 days and 6 nights without a moment's let-up. The results of that battle are already known to all of us. Geilenkirchen taken, an advance northeast of it along the Worm Valley, and a penetration of some importance into the Siegfried defences. I've been hearing today some of the details of the fighting, of the guts and gallantry which went into this operation and made it a success. Right at the start, for instance, while the gapping teams, as they're called, were working away in the hour before dawn to clear pathways through the German minefields, our columns assembling along the roads behind the minefields came under intense enemy fire. Dispersal was essential, but it was impossible to get off the roads, and the way ahead was still barred by mines. Without hesitation, the troop leader of the tanks at the head of the column decided to chance his arm, as he casually put it. Chancing his arm meant driving his tank right across the still uncleared minefield, and risking not only the mines, but also the fire from the German anti-tank defences further forward. He got through, and our columns moved forward in his tracks, getting out of the way of that punishing enemy shell fire further back. Eventually, a lucky shot from an enemy anti-tank gun struck the leading tank and set it afire. The tank was destroyed, and the troop leader was wounded. But his job was done. By now, our armour was streaming through the gap in the minefield and engaging the surprised Germans in the pillboxes further ahead. They told me about those pillboxes, each one manned by 30 or 40 men. For not only were the Germans inside each casemate, they were ringed around its perimeter outside, too, in slit trenches. Our tanks poured lead into those trenches until all the Germans in them surrendered or were killed. The crews said that once the tanks got really close, the German infantry in the trenches gave up. Several hundreds of them came out and were taken prisoner. Then, having dealt with the outer defences of each fortification, our tanks knocked out the German gun inside each pillbox. And to finish the job off, they dealt with the enemy troops inside the pillboxes, either by bulldozing several feet of earth over the air hole, or else by firing smoke shells around it, so that the occupants had to come out and show themselves, or else suffocate. It was a very effective technique. They'd planned to use flamethrowers, but in the end they were afraid to do so, because the blaze of light would silhouette the tanks and make them easy targets for the Germans. But sappers coming along behind the tanks put large blocks of high explosive into each pillbox and blew it sky high. They have some incredible stories of encounters with enemy tanks, with the Tigers and Mark IVs thrown in by the Germans in a hopeless attempt to drive them back. How they stalked the German armour, played hide-and-seek with it in the woods. One officer was waiting in his tank by a farmhouse when he heard a Tiger coming down the road towards him. Telling his driver to hide the Sherman behind the back of the building, this officer jumped out and laid some mines in the roadway in the path of the approaching Tiger. Then he rejoined his own tank. The tracks of the Tiger were blown off by the mines, and before the German crew inside had a chance of bailing out, the Sherman, coming round the house behind the Tiger, put in a few rounds of shell fire at close range, which brewed the German tank up completely. Then there was the British tank commander, who, under cover of a smoke screen, took his tank across 1,000 yards of open swamp under murderous enemy fire, and found cover in a small clump of trees. From there he fired his guns into the enemy positions at close range until all his ammunition was exhausted, and then, waiting quietly for darkness, he brought his tank back again by night to our own positions. There was great bravery shown by our men in this battle, for the fighting was fierce, and we took considerable casualties. As always, it was the tank commanders who suffered most. Up in their turrets, they made easy targets for the enemy snipers in the woods and buildings around them, and many were wounded in the head by shells bursting near their tanks. But our men have the satisfaction of knowing that in this first encounter on German soil, they gave the enemy a sound beating.
And what is your tank destroyer?
My tank destroyer is Crusher the Second, sir.
Crusher the Second?
Yes, sir.
Understand that you have 9 tanks to your credit, is that right?
Yes, sir, but that isn't too much, sir. We're looking for more right now.
Well, good for you, Corporal. Tell me about these 9 German tanks that you've knocked out.
Well, I'll tell you about 5 of them because we knocked them all out at one time. We were put up in a position one night. We didn't know what was around us, and all we were is a semi-dug-in setup. And we heard rifle fire all around us, but we couldn't pay much attention to it, figuring that the infantry could handle that. When the fire got a little bit too intense, we started to pay some attention. And before we knew it, there were 88s firing all around us, and our periscopes were just blood red with this fire. And during the interim, our staff sergeant, Sergeant John A. Bertuzzi of the Bronx, happened to be at the gun at the time, and he took over. And on the insistence of Sergeant McCumsky, our tank destroyer commander, he opened fire on something that looked like a tank in immediate right vicinity.
Was it daylight yet?
It wasn't quite daylight, sir. It was just a half light, but we opened fire anyway, chancing it anyway. And sure enough, the tank did go up, and we followed up with an HE shot, which set around fire, and that lit up the other 4 tanks right in the draw. And
Four more tanks?
There were 4 more tanks there in the draw, and we started to fire upon them consecutively. Of course, there was a hell of a lot of return fire, but we were able to take it, and we just kept going at them, sir.
You kept knocking them out one after another?
Kept knocking them out one after the other.
What kind of tanks were they, Corporal?
Well, there were a couple of Marks, and the rest were smaller models. We just couldn't make them out, but we found out in the morning they were lighter tanks than the Mark.
Well, did they throw any fire back at you?
The fire was coming around us at all sides. It even knocked out one of our tanks in our platoon to our immediate rear left, but we didn't know about that till morning.
Any hit your tank?
No, we only got some shrapnel, luckily.
Well, how about the personnel inside the tank, the Germans?
The personnel in the tanks were crawling out as fast as they could, but Corporal Nick Saturio, who happened to be in our tank at the time from the security section mounted up on the rear deck, manned the 50 caliber machine gun and just mowed them down as they come out, like dead rats.
Good scoop. And you got how many tanks that day?
We got 5 tanks that morning, and we got 4 more the rest of the day, totaling 9.
Boy, that is what I call a real day's work.
Well, we're looking for more. Just bring them on.
The forces of the British Empire in Western Europe spent Christmas 1944 in the field. But what a change has come over the scene since last Christmas. The supreme battle of Normandy carried with it the liberation of France and Belgium. Last Christmas we were in England, expectant and full of hope. This Christmas we are fighting in Germany. The conquest of Germany remains. It would have needed a brave man to say on D-Day, the 6th of June, that in 3 months we would be in Brussels and Antwerp, having liberated nearly the whole of France and Belgium. And in 6 months we would be fighting in Germany, having driven the enemy back across his own frontiers. But this is what has happened, and we must not fail to give the praise and honor where it is due. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. At Christmas time, whether in our homes or fighting in the field, we like to sing the carols we learnt as children, and in truth, this is indeed a link between us and our families and friends in the home country, since they are singing the same verses. The old words express exactly what we all feel today. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. That is what we are fighting for. That is what we desire. On earth peace, goodwill toward men. And so today we sing the Christmas hymns, full of hope and steadfast in our belief that soon we shall achieve our heart's desire. Therefore, with faith in God, and with enthusiasm for our cause and for the day of battle, let us continue the contest with stout hearts and with determination to conquer. And at this time, I send to each one of you my best wishes and my Christmas greetings. Wherever you may be, fighting in the front line, or working on the lines of communication, or in the ports, I wish all of you good luck and a happy 1945. We are all one great team. Together, you and I, we have achieved much, and together we will see the thing through to the end. Good luck to you all.
Hello, BBC. This is a dispatch from Ian Wilson in France. Here is the story of the Battle of Bastogne and of its gallant and successful defense by the men of the 101st Airborne Division. This division jumped into action in Normandy and Holland, but when the Germans recently broke through in the Ardennes, the airborne men went into battle for the first time in trucks, and they were fighting within 30 hours of being alerted in their rest areas. Now, with the threat to the very important road center of Bastogne beaten off, the defenders have time to tell what happened when the town was encircled by the Germans. And here is the man who said nuts to the impudent and arrogant German demand for their surrender. Brigadier General A.C. McAuliffe, Deputy Commander of the 101st Airborne Division and Commander of Bastogne.
It didn't occur to us until it was all over that the eyes of the world were on the 101st Airborne Division and the attached armor during the defense of Bastogne. The first thing we heard
was that we had been rescued by the 4th Armored Division. Now I, and everyone else in the 101st, resent the implication that we were rescued or that we needed to be rescued. When General Taylor arrived on the 27th, the first thing he asked me was, "What kind of shape are we in?" I told him, "Well, we're in fine shape. We're ready to take the offensive." General Taylor said, "I should have known it, but all that stuff I read in the newspapers was beginning to worry me just a little." The fact is, we were thinking about what a tough time the crowd was having. We weren't alarmed about our own position at all. After all, we deliberately jumped into just that kind of position in Normandy and Holland. The worst part of it for me was the loss of the hospital and the division surgeon and the surgical team. On the first day, the Germans captured the division hospital and took prisoner every division surgeon. After that, we couldn't give the wounded the care they deserved. But the wounded were magnificent. Not a word of complaint from them. We commandeered some cognac and gave them about 3 ounces every night. That helped. I went up to one lad lying there with a compound fracture of the femur. I said to him, "How you doing?" He looked up at me and said, "I'm doing fine, General. You know, we've got a new name for ourselves. We call ourselves the battered, let's call it blighters. We call ourselves the battered blighters of the bastion of Bastogne." For the first 3 days of the Battle of Bastogne, there was fog. On the 4th day, it cleared. After that, terrific was the only word to describe the air support we got from those thunderbolts. Those are the guttiest fellows I ever saw. The air support officer we had was a captain named Parker. He really knew his stuff and ran a great circus. He called himself Maestro. He has a fine gift for salty language, and when he was telling those airplanes what to do, there was always a big crowd of soldiers standing around just listening to him talk. Finally got so bad we had to rope him off. But Maestro Parker and those thunderbolts really did a job for us. For the first 3 days, we gave the Germans a licking of their lives. On the 3rd day, the German commander had the effrontery to send us a surrender demand. When we got it, we thought it was the funniest thing we ever heard. I just laughed and said nuts. But the German major who brought it wanted a formal answer. So I decided, I'd just say nuts. So I had it written out. Quote, to the German commander, nuts. Signed, the American commander, unquote. The Troop Carry Command did a great job on the supply end, too. They brought us all the ammunition, rations, and other equipment that we needed. Our morale was always tops. Good morale is just as contagious as panic can be. We had several thousand reinforcements and attached troops, and they caught the infectious courage of the old men of the 101st right away. Airborne divisions always have good morale. We were fortunate enough to have been associated with the 1st and 6th British Airborne Divisions, and we saw something of the 1st British Airborne Division up around Arnhem. They don't come any better. No one should be surprised at what the 101st Airborne Division did at Bastogne. That is what should be expected any time of airborne troops. With that kind of troops I had, a commander can do anything.
The aircrew whose job it is to attack the V2 sites are a very mixed lot. In our squadron alone, there are Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and a Belgian, and our CO was born in South America. Attacks are also made by a Polish squadron. Our own squadron was lucky enough to be the first to attack the V2 sites in Holland. The routine was something like this. We operate from dawn till dusk, each squadron flying as many as 3 trips a day, and we've got to fly out from this country every time. Our aircraft are Spitfires, and our main job is to bomb the sites. At first, we used to rely on strafing the targets, but our new method of attack is proving more and more successful. I think it's true to say that just as the Tempest was found to be the best aircraft against flying bombs, so the Spitfire is the best so far against the V2. This is partly due to the nature of the targets, both the launching sites and the store sheds. The launching site is a very small affair. It's just a square of concrete, usually buried in the heart of a wood. It's always well camouflaged. The stores, too, are in the woods, but they're kept well away from the launching sites. These stores are generally long, low buildings, and when you get a direct hit on them, there's a pretty big explosion, to put it mildly. Wood and debris, and a good deal of it, flies all over the place. When we first attacked the V2 sites, Jerry used to fire the things off even when we were over him. In those days, we not only saw the vapor trails, but also saw the projectiles themselves. A V2, as it's going up, looks rather like an elongated 303 bullet. And by the way, it does not go straight up as you would expect. It takes a sort of zigzag course until it disappears into the stratosphere. But the enemy doesn't fire them off nowadays when we're overhead. They gave that up some time ago. When we found out this, we decided to keep a permanent vigil over them throughout the daylight hours. So now the first squadron goes in just after dawn, drops its bombs, and stoodies about over the target area until it's relieved by the next squadron. And so it goes on all day. But even now, we don't only bomb. We strafe everything that moves on the ground, too. For example, any road traffic or trains. One day after we'd searched the whole neighborhood for some time without any success, we suddenly saw a train with about a dozen traps traveling through the target area. We reckoned it must have been pretty important for the Jerry to take the risk of moving by daylight, even though he knew we were there. We gave it everything we had. I remember we put in no less than 16 attacks. And what's it like to attack a V2 launching site? When we attack, we go in a steep dive. As we approach the target before actually going into the dive, Jerry sends up everything he can lay his hands on. All kinds of ack-ack, both light and heavy. The great secret in the attack is speed. That's our only means of defense, because of course we have no escort to draw away the flak. The worst moment is on the dive itself, when everything seems to be concentrated on you. Then the bombs go, you can feel them go, the whole plane becomes lighter and freer, and then you pull out and swing away as quickly as possible. You must remember that the target is pretty small, and your bombing must therefore be very accurate. In fact, it's pinpoint bombing. We use the same technique for attacking the stores. Then when you've done your bombing, you begin your patrol until the next squadron arrives to take over. All this may not sound very spectacular, but I can assure you that we're doing a good deal of damage.
The Germans held a little wood to the northeast of Gamsheim. Our object was to get a close view of the wood from the edge of a small canal that formed its defense to the west. I adjusted the periscope as we went, and through it discovered the strange concentrated view of battle that the tank man gets. The same sort of impression that you have when you look at a cinefilm through a home projector. The scene changed with a jerk as the periscope swung or the tank swiveled around, and the roar of the tank's engines drowned the shell fire or the rattle of machine guns. Inside the tank you felt curiously isolated from the battle. The little puffs of white smoke marking our shells falling in the wood, and the black smudges of the air bursts over the fields to the right, somehow didn't seem to be connected personally with you. You could sit and stare at the wood, not a sign in it of the Germans, with almost complete detachment, until suddenly you began to notice that the snow around you was being puckered with little spurts of white smoke. Enemy mortars. Although you couldn't see them, they were in the wood all right, and had ordered up fire to chase us off. The steel walls of the tank immediately became as thin as paper in my mind. I felt what every tank man must feel when he's under fire. The sense of being the biggest object on the landscape, of being miles from the nearest safe foxhole. Our tank swung away out of range and back to safety down the tree-lined road through the water meadows. My 3 minutes glimpse of the German lines was over.
As far as my battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers is concerned, the battle that burst the Siegfried Line and led to the capture of Cleve was won before it started. We trained and trained and trained in the cooperation of arms, and that's how we got through with practically no bother at all. It was all laid on. Every man knew what he had to do and how he was going to do it. As an example, take our rehearsal with flamethrowers. Our flamethrowers would shoot their flame on the ground in front of our troops, and they would run through the fire. It was a bit frightening at first, but after we had run through the flames 2 or 3 times, we were full of confidence and would run through without hesitation and without harm. Later on, the effect of the flamethrowers on the Germans was seen. I heard one prisoner being asked why he gave himself up. Why, he said, the Flammenwerfer only missed me by a yard. However, to go on with my story, as well as training the men in cooperation of weapons, before the operation began, every man was told exactly what was going to happen and when it would happen. He knew exactly his place in the vehicle he was to ride in, where his equipment and weapons would go, even what side of the vehicle he would dismount from, and what he would see and should do when he did dismount. In short, every detail was worked out beforehand, and the men appreciated and took great interest in this briefing. Only 2 things interfered with these carefully laid plans, the weather and the floods. But we got over that, and whenever a vehicle got ditched or stuck in the mud, the men bailed out and got into another one. The Royal Scots Fusiliers went through on one of the only bits of unflooded ground, a narrow neck between the northern edge of the Reichswald and the completely wet area between the Rhine where the Canadians were paddling about. There was only one road available to us, a narrow third-class road, almost impassable because of the mud. And on this one road, all our fighting and supply vehicles were queued up. Tanks, self-propelled guns, and all the vehicles with the fancy zoological names, such as the kangaroos, that's the armoured troop carriers, which are really tanks minus their innards and turrets. And the wasps, these are Bren carriers converted for flame-throwing. And the crocodiles, this is a big edition of the wasp, a flame-throwing tank. All these vehicles, as well as the supply vehicles, were lined up nose to tail, waiting to be called forward through the gaps of the minefields. By this time, the forward brigades had taken their objectives in the Siegfried line, and Boche prisoners were beginning to come back. They were in pretty poor shape and didn't need much looking after. In fact, when a bunch of them came trudging down the muddy road without an escort and wanted to give themselves up, one of my platoon commanders, who was sitting on top of a kangaroo, just pointed backwards over his shoulder with his thumb and said, "Grossbeak." And the German said, "Ja, Grossbeak," and shuffled off on their own. They knew where to go, because Grossbeak had been a rest centre for Siegfried line troops until we moved in. Well, we pushed on in soaking rain, and when we got near to Cleve, I sent forward a platoon at first light in the morning to find out what was happening in the town. They got into the outskirts of the town, took up positions in a house, and sent back a runner to report the situation to me. On the way back, this chap was sniped at and hit in the upper arm, and had to be carried back to my company headquarters. After he had made his official report, he was greatly concerned that his water bottle should be removed from his equipment and sent back to his platoon, down in Cleve. I thought he was raving a bit and told him not to worry, and then had him taken to the regimental aid post. So off he went, still reminding us to send his water bottle back to the troops. I was a bit busy, and I'm afraid I forgot all about his water bottle. Anyway, although the boys might be short of water, they surely wouldn't be as short as all that. However, about an hour later, the company sergeant major came into headquarters and started to brew up some tea. He picked up the handiest water bottle he saw lying about and started pouring the contents into his mess tin. It was rum. So the wounded runner's concern was explained. He had been in charge of the platoon's ration and wanted it to get back to them. He sent it back, under fire. The men who took it were sniped at, but the rum got there safely. We followed it into Cleve pretty soon after, and about the first thing we saw there were 2 bulldozers clearing the streets of rubble. I had seen these vehicles the night before while we were clearing out some strong points covering the road into the town. There was quite a lot of shooting going on when the 2 bulldozers came rattling along the road. My CO stopped them. "Where are you going?" he asked the drivers. "Cleve, sir," they answered. "You can't go there. The roads are under fire." What kind of fire, they asked. Oh, small arms fire. Rifles, machine guns. You'll get shot at if you get on there. Any anti-tank guns, sir? No. Then, if you please, sir, we'll go on. You see, sir, our orders are to have the roads clear for the morning, and we're armoured. We'll get through all right. And get through they did, for as I said, there they were, sweeping the debris from the streets of Cleve when we came in the morning. After we had taken our part of the town, we were able to relax a bit and draw breath, and I took this opportunity to get my fellows together and let them know how the action was going. So I gathered them in the big room of a not too badly damaged house, and using the door as a blackboard, started to illustrate the action with a chalk-drawn map. While I was talking, I found the men were not paying attention. Their eyes kept straying to the floor, so I stopped talking and looked at the floor myself. The place was littered with rice marks, all of 5 marks value. You should have seen the dive when I gave them permission to pick them up. And this is as good a point as any to break off the story of the Royal Scots Fusiliers in Germany. The men are fit and in wonderful spirits.
In attempting to defend their countryside, the German army asked for trouble and got it. A dread visitation which has blanketed hundreds of miles of a prosperous, fertile agricultural land with overwhelming disaster. You feel it in your very bones as you motor up to our advanced positions. An air of depression and hopelessness seems to charge the very atmosphere. There are scores of German villages, or what were once German villages, the romantic sort of places German students used to sing about with a great deal of nostalgia, the type of showplace which figured prominently on the glossy pages of the world's art publications before the war. Well, many of those villages will never appear again in the same form. They are no longer human habitations, but mere stone husks, often blackened and burnt out from end to end, the result of our artillery and Air Force answer to Hitler's boast that he would defend every town and village and house between here and the Rhine. There's not a sign of life about most of these places, not even the usual stray cat or dog. In roadside ditches and fields, grey, mud-encrusted carcasses of dead cattle and horses lie rotting and festering. Green parklands and meadows are crisscrossed with 1,000 ruts where our tanks and our heavy guns and other transport have manoeuvred or parked. Belts of woodland, those pine and fir forests of western Germany, look as though some giant has passed that way, slashing through them with an outsize in razors and scything them to the ground. That's what woodlands look like after a shelling. Here and there you see a not too badly smashed cottage or farm. Maybe there's a shell hole in the roof or in one of the living room walls. You go inside and have a look round. In one room, 2 or 3 doughboys are cooking a meal out of tins over a stove. The next room is the operational headquarters of their unit. You notice that the household belongings of the Germans who'd lived there have been pushed on one side. You feel there's something symbolic about that. Also about the photograph of the blonde young German soldier, a son or nephew of the household, who looks down from the wall but can't do anything about it. Back again, down on the main road, you meet more evidence of what it feels like to be a German today. A couple of hundred men and women and children are trudging slowly and painfully up the muddy road in a long line split up into family groups. At either end of the column and at points along the line, there are armed guards who are taking these country folk to civilian camps nearby. The guards watch them carefully. They're not afraid that any of them may attempt to break away, but what they are afraid of is the possibility that some of these folk, the older folk, may stray towards the roadsides which still hide German mines. Wherever you go up here, miles of white tape shut off side lanes and pathways where mines have still to be cleared. But these civilians march on, seemingly oblivious to the dangers lurking on either side of them. They carry small bundles of clothing and other things they've been able to salvage from the wreckage. 1 or 2 have suitcases, and here and there a man pushes a handcart in front of him. Their clothing still bears the traces of the frightened vigil spent in the fields and the woods and caves, while their homes were being shot to bits. The small children look at you with curiosity and obviously wonder what it's all about. Their elders, particularly the middle-aged folk, they stumble ahead, giving you an occasional nervous glance, but for the most part, they walk on, unheeding, seeing nothing and hearing nothing. Men and women immersed in the tide of disaster which is beginning to sweep over the doorsteps of thousands of German homes.
I have just come out of the battered and bruised corpse that was once the living city of Cologne. I was able to get into a point well past the park system, that is near the sports palace. But even there, a mile or so from the heart of what used to be Cologne, one could see the desert of waste and rubble that was once romantic, gay Cologne. From the top of an electric tower that had somehow escaped the wrath and vengeance of Bomber Command, I could see through my glasses, through the drizzle, the broad bulk of the city down to the Rhine. Standing brooding over the ruins of the city was a beautiful cathedral, a monument to the uncanny accuracy of Bomber Command navigators and bomb aimers. Acre on acre of rubble surrounds the Gothic-style cathedral. The railway station just across the road is flattened, the great marshalling yards and rail lines spinning out from the heart of the city like so many threads of a giant spider web were lying twisted and torn. According to a Frenchman who had been a slave laborer and had just been freed in time to act as our guide, the cathedral is practically undamaged. Here and there, even in the suburbs of the German city, shreds of buildings cling desperately to a sprawling skeleton of streets. When we went in this morning with American infantry, you could see the bunkers, the basements, and the cellars that have been the living quarters for those still inhabiting the city. The resistance has been sporadic, but the Germans that are still there have been using some of the AK guns for ground defense. Some of them are 88s that for lack of petrol were unable to be moved. Others were set defenses in concrete bases. The Americans, however, were quickly getting the upper hand, simply by maneuver, for with them there is certainly no shortage of petrol. On the way to Cologne, we passed through many German towns and small cities, Jülich and Düren and many others, all in ruins like the great Rhineland city, but pocket additions compared to the devastation of Cologne. One did not have to spend much time even in the suburbs to see that patience and perseverance of Bomber Command has indeed been well rewarded. In several of the outlying towns, we passed German civilians in the cold rain, pushing bicycles, push carts, anything with wheels, all packed to the roof with their personal belongings. Late last night, I went forward to a forward command post, and on the road, our dim lights of our Jeep picked up women and children and men, all on the roads moving back from Cologne.
The Allies are across the Rhine. Troops under General Hodges established a bridgehead on the east bank south of Bonn yesterday afternoon. The west bank of the Rhine between Cologne and Bonn has been almost cleared, and First Army troops are in Bonn itself. British forces have entered Xanten. Nearly 3,000 Allied planes have attacked targets in Germany today. On the eastern front, Rokossovsky has made a new advance against the isolated German armies defending Danzig. Yesterday's gains by Zhukov put Stettin out of action as a port. Allied troops have entered the suburbs of Mandalay. 30,000 Japanese are encircled in the area. Troops of the American First Army crossed the Rhine south of Cologne at 4:30 yesterday afternoon. This triumphant news was given us late this evening by Frank Gillard, our correspondent with General Bradley's 12th Army Group. A Reuters report from the 1st American Army says that the crossing was made at Remagen, which is about 25 miles south of Cologne between Bonn and Koblenz. Few other details are known yet, but all reports say that the crossing was made against only weak opposition, and the First Army's bridgehead on the east bank was described tonight as being firm.
The first Americans to cross the River Rhine at Remagen is Sergeant Alexander A. Drabik from Holland, Ohio. He is a squad leader in the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 9th Armored Division, and he's here with me now. A tall, quiet American
still pretty well covered with Rhine mud, and he's a lot more scared about making this recording than he apparently was about crossing the Ludendorff Bridge. Will you tell us about that crossing, Sergeant Breivik?
Well, we never expected to cross when we did. We thought the Germans surely would have blown the bridge, but we got there much faster than they expected, and they weren't very well organized. 2 other platoons started to cross ahead of my platoon, but they got pinned down by machine gun fire from the towers and tunnel on the other side of the river. When I saw the fellows up ahead weren't going to move, I decided to lead my squad across. I turned around and yelled, "Come on, boys, let's go," across, and we took off on a double. They say this bridge is about 250 yards long, but it seemed to me like 250 miles. The Germans were shooting at us, but so far as I know, there wasn't a man in my company that was hit. When we got to the other side, we turned left and entered the little town and set up a skirmish line. Then we laid down covering fire while the rest of the company came across. There was an engineer lieutenant in the middle of the bridge, and he was ignoring the machine gun and rifle fire that was coming at him. He was cutting the wires on the demolition the Germans had prepared and was dumping them into the river. The Germans had managed to set off one charge before we started across, but it didn't do much damage. I kept thinking that if it hadn't been for the work of this engineering lieutenant, the Germans would have blown the bridge while we were on it. I didn't know who he was, but he is the man who saved the bridge. He was still rolling charges into the bridge when I passed him, and as far as I know, he didn't get hurt. That man had a lot of guts. After we had set foot on the east bank of the Rhine, I asked the squad how they felt. They said they felt okey-doke, and one of them said he'd feel a lot better if the bridge stayed in. I told him it would stay. I just had a feeling.
Thank you, Sergeant. Well, that's how the infantry goes across. The bridge did stay in, and the tanks came across, and the first tank over was commanded by short, dark, and confident Sergeant William J. Goodson of Rushville, Indiana, a tank commander in the 14th Tank Battalion of the 9th Armored Division. He's here, too, and I shall ask him to continue the story. Carry on, Sergeant.
I can tell you that the crossing came as a bigger surprise to me than it did to the Germans. We had thought surely the Germans would blow the bridge before we got there, so we figured we'd get a rest after we cleared Remagen. I first heard about the bridge being intact while I was listening to my tank radio. It was hard to believe. We started to cross the bridge after dark. It was so dark that a man had to cross in front of us to guide us over. He was a little hard to follow, but the Germans didn't interfere at all. I couldn't understand why they weren't shelling the bridge at that time. We finally got across. We turned to the right and started up to the roadblock, which we were to reinforce with my tank and 4 others that followed me. I didn't see the roadblock and ran past it. I was about 800 yards beyond it before I realized it. And that was when I got into trouble. A whole lot of German infantry opened up on my tank with rifles and burp guns and came running at my tank. They even climbed on it. My crew fought them off with machine guns until they got so hot they jammed. While they were clearing their guns, I got my grease gun, that is a submachine gun, and started spraying the Germans. When I emptied a clip, I'd throw out a few hand grenades, then duck and reload my gun while I waited for the grenades to go off. When they exploded, I'd pop back up out of my turret and start spraying the Germans again. I still didn't feel like I was throwing enough lead, so I radioed to the tank about 75 yards behind me to spray the ground around me. That helped a lot, and finally the Jerries gave up their crazy attack, and we backed up 300 yards to a curve in the road and figured that was a good place as any to spend the rest of the night. We had no more trouble that night. It was pretty quiet after that. We just sat tight. Then the next morning, our infantry attacked past us. We laid down a covering fire to support them.
Thank you, Sergeant. That's how the 9th Armored Division, the division that von Rundstedt called the Phantom Division, crossed the Rhine and established the bridgehead that has given the Germans their biggest headache since D-Day.
The battle order, the schedule of operations for this great airborne landing in Germany, took up a score of pages of typewritten foolscap, with appendices and charts and timetables and maps. By reading it, you could see how immensely complicated is such an operation. In fact, how great a triumph today has been for Allied planning and execution. The Germans had said that they were ready for airborne landings. They were not, I think, expecting anything quite as powerful and concentrated as this, the biggest airborne force ever carried in one attack. It was British and American, flying parallel within easy sight of each other, the Halifaxes and the Stirlings towing their Horsers and Hamel cars, the Dakotas each drawing their 2 Wacko gliders. Around us all, giving encouraging flashes in the sun, dashed the little fighters, British and American too, some from bases in England, some from the forward airfields on the northwestern front. Slowly, I thought contemptuously, the great air fleet moved into Germany. It was so long that the head of the procession was now passing us on its way out. A Stirling shot by with flames coming from its belly. 4 white parachutes fled from it and opened and swayed off down to the river bank. The Stirling crashed in a great gout of flame. You thought of the human element then. I looked back to see it through one of our rear windows and caught the eye of Bob Wade, my engineer, crouched over his apparatus. I knew that he'd seen it too. Ahead of us, German flak was staining the sky with its blue-black ink spots. Another tug went down, flaming. No one got out. The tail broke off a glider behind us and went spinning away. The glider paused a second as though surprised, and then reared up and fell, somersaulting. There are no parachutes in gliders. We were almost on the dropping zone now, the patchwork of fields that I'd seen marked out on large-scale photographs, lying below us in the glare of the sun and a dazzling mist. We called up Hamilcar 277 for the last time. You are over your dropping zone now. The Halifax skipped a little as the glider let go. We turned sharply, and a great bunch of flak turned with us just off the starboard wing. 277 wheeled away beautifully, and then I lost sight of her as she joined the hundreds of others, banking silently down like a flight of tired moths, seeking their rest on the ground. And as we turned, I saw simultaneously the smoke of 5 aircraft, blazing like torches in the fields and the woods just below. Some German guns fired, and the Typhoons, who were patrolling on the lookout for just such a thing, swooped and were gone down in a flash to strafe the gunners. Our fighter protection had been first class, but you can't subdue everyone, and there were some of our force who paid the price for hauling their gliders to the right spot at the right time. We, who were lucky, edged out of it and belted back for the Rhine, where Allied guns were setting up grey smoke clouds and Allied craft were crossing the broad river. There were tanks closing up in the winding roads of the West Bank and great convoys of lorries. Below us, the army was on the move into Germany, and back in the flak stains and the mist, its spearhead was now on the ground and fighting, by the empty hulks of the gliders, among the black pillars of smoke, the funeral pyres of some of those whose pride it had been to lead the spearhead in.
I'm up forward with the crew. Behind me are our one-way passengers. 17 United States paratroopers, including a general whose name I must withhold. In a short time is going to jump with his men across the Rhine into the Ruhr. Some of the men are dozing, some singing gently. 2 are reading Marshal Montgomery's personal message to them,
handed to them shortly before coming aboard. Some were smoking and some chewing gum. Each man is loaded with more equipment than he could walk with. As I'm carrying no weight at all except a parachute, I did myself useful earlier on helping some of them aboard. They nearly pulled me off. As I said, they are pretty heavily laden with static parachutes, emergency chutes, a variety of rifles, pistols, grenades, and ammunition. But all the personal comforts they've got are contained in one small haversack. Most of us are sitting in shadow, but the sun beaming in through the open doorway of the Dakota throws a golden light on the helmet of a rather grim-faced captain and reminds me irresistibly of Rembrandt's painting of the man in armor. It's a bit lonely up here in front. As I said, we're the leading plane, but looking back I can see our wingmen just astern of us and on each side. And behind them a great flight of troop carriers stretching way back into the distance until they're just little black dots. But our immediate neighbors are so close that I can see a face at every window, and my 3 sign to the plane on our starboard has just brought a cheery thumbs-up signal. Away ahead I can see 1, 2, 3 great strings of troop carriers, and pretty soon we'll meet some more, and then more and more, until we go across the Rhine in thousands. I suppose fighters and bombers, as well as troop carriers, there will be at this moment well over 5,000 aircraft in the air. We're getting up near the battle area now, and a great blue-grey mist of smoke is blotting out the whole horizon. The red light's been on about 3 minutes, and we must be getting very close to the dropping zone. The boys waiting to jump are now standing up, their parachute harness hooked to the static line. The lieutenant next to me, he's just given a grin and a wink. Green light. There they go. 1, 2. Good luck, boys. There goes the general. 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, 16, last man gone. They've jumped right down into the haze, into Germany, and already they're almost out of sight. It's sort of lonely here now that they've gone. There's no flag, at least I don't think so. Well, that might be a puff away far ahead, coming up through the haze. But bombers and the guns must have done a very good job down there. I hope these boys who just jumped find it quiet when they get down.
Now we're moving out of our position on the flank of the runway and into the middle of the track, taking up the strain on our tow rope so that Hamilcar 277 comes up behind us. The engines are being revved up to their full peak, and we are off. Forward down the runway, gathering speed quite steadily, watching and waiting for the glider behind to lift from the ground. Full boost now, flat out, forward as hard as we can go down the runway. And the Hamilcar is lifting. The Hamilcar has risen up behind us into the air. I'm holding on my grim death now. We're bumping slightly down the runway. The navigator's holding the throttle wide open. Down we go, gathering speed, heavier and heavier, faster and faster. Now we're beginning to lift slightly. In another half minute we shall be airborne. Pilot's holding her, and we're off. We're off the ground. We're climbing gently into the air. The glider riding steadily behind us, following in the line of aircraft and gliders that I can see wheeling away to starboard ahead of us. We're in the air, and we are on the way.
Hello, glider. Tug pilot calling.
Hello, tug pilot. Glider pilot answering to pass your message.
Hello, glider pilot. Everything okay at your end?
Hello, tug pilot. Yes, everything's fine, thank you.
Good show.
Stanley, Maxted in the glider here. Well, it won't be long now. The men have all taken off their life belts and have taken a last businesslike look at their automatic rifles. It must soon be time to cast off. remember, these men were the first to land on D-Day. Remember? So, Richard Dimbleby, tell them when you get back about these guys and how they went into battle again. Tell Britain, Richard. Tell the world.
Over to starboard of us as we come back over the Rhine, the guns are firing, raising great gulps of grey smoke. There's another aircraft down. I see it just hit the ground and burst. I think it's a fighter. I'm afraid that I've never seen more aircraft go down in a short time, but I still do not think that we've suffered very badly in this putting down of the greatest single airborne force ever taken anywhere. There now is the smoke of the guns firing on the battlefront behind us. We're going flat out now, making for home. No sense in staying about here where we can get away. Navigator's calling up for its course, the skipper's giving it to him. The gliders now have settled out of sight. They're circling down to their landing ground.
Yeah, you're good.
And all I can see as we come away from the mist and the smoke that lies on the eastern bank of the Rhine are black pillars of fire and a grey mass, thick grey gun clouds as they float gently away in the breeze beyond the river. We are coming up to the Rhine.
Right, straight up.
The Rhine lies left and right across our path below us, shining in the sunlight, wide and with sweeping curves. And the whole of this mighty airborne army is now crossing and filling the whole sky. We haven't come as far as this without some loss. On our right-hand side, a Dakota has just gone down in flames. We watched it go to the ground, and I've just seen the parachutes of it blossoming and floating down towards the river. Above us and below us, and collecting close round us now, are the tugs as they take their gliders in. Down there is the smoke of battle. There is the smoke screen laid by the army, lying right across the far bank of the river. Dense clouds of brown and grey smoke coming up. And now our skipper's talking to the glider pilot and warning him that we're nearly there, preparing to cast him off. Ahead of us, another pillar of black smoke marks the spot where an aircraft has gone down. And yet another one. It's a Sterling, a British Sterling, is going down with flames coming out from under its belly.
Where's that?
And more parachutes are coming out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 parachutes have come out of the Sterling. It goes on its way to the ground, but we haven't got time to watch it further because we're coming up now to the exact chosen landing ground where our airborne forces have to be put down. And no matter what the opposition may be, we have got to keep straight on, dead on, to the exact position. There's only a minute or two to go. We've crossed the Rhine. We're on the east bank of the river. We're passing now over the army's smoke cloud. Down there I see tanks moving forward along a road, and more tanks moving across the field.
Glider pilot. Hello,
we're quite low down now,
calling.
at less than 3,000 feet, and we would be low enough to see individuals on the ground.
Stand by.
In just one moment we shall let go. All over the sky ahead of us, here comes the point.
Now.
The glider has gone. We've cast off our glider. Our glider's gone. We've let her go. There she goes down behind us. We turn hard away in a tight circle to port to get out of this area. I'm sorry if I'm shouting. This is a very tremendous sight. Halifax is now streaming across underneath us and let their gliders...
Okay, Scotty, we'll let the rope go. Okay, behind us.
Coming in. Now we're watching in front and behind to see if there are any enemy fighters. Touch wood, we haven't spotted one yet. Now the pilot gives a full boost.
What's your new course, Tex?
And off we go on the course home. The gliders are going down now, freed suddenly from the fifth stream of the bombers, are dropping,
They're all going down together.
dropping like great dark moths, freed from the force of the bombers and slowly floating down to earth. There lies the battle zone right under us as we turn back, a patchwork of fields. No human movement, only the smoke coming from the bombers that have gone down, those of our force that have been lost. And now over there on our starboard bow, fighters streaking in. They're obviously after somebody. They're coming up fast. It's all right. They're our own Typhoons keeping up an anti-flak patrol.
This is Stanley Maxted speaking from Germany. I have just returned from the 6th British Airborne Division, during which I passed through the lines of the Scottish troops which knifed through to link up with the surrounded airborne men. Last night, I believe you heard Richard Dimbleby's account of the breakaway from our glider of the big Halifax that was towing us. Well, after that, there was just a minute or two of quiet as the great Hamel car ran in with the sound of the rushing wind in her wings. Then, when just a few feet off the ground, pandemonium broke loose. The wicked snap of Spandau machine guns mixed with the slower bong of 20-millimeter incendiaries for just a fraction of a second before they started pricking out their trademark in the thin skin of the glider. Things seemed to happen too quickly for me to take them all in at once. There was an explosion that appeared to be inside my head, the smell of burnt cordite. I went down on one knee. Something hot and sickly was dripping over my right eye and off my chin and all over my clothes. There was a doom-like lurch and a great rending as smoke, dust, and daylight came from nowhere. I saw my pal, Peter Cattle, lying on one elbow with blood making a spider web over his face. One of the men was on the floor, staring fixedly at nothing as one of his legs, rigid in front of him, was quivering in convulsions like a stricken eel. I saw the Bren carrier go inexorably out of the nose of the glider, carrying the whole works ahead of it, and wiping 2 signalers off the top of it like flies. Even then, the bullets kept crashing through the wreckage. It didn't seem fair, but then there's no fair or unfair in airborne fighting. At the moment of impact, a Jeep trailer that was chained just behind me came forward about 6 inches and caught me in the small of the back. Mercifully, the chains held on. Somehow, Peter and I hurled ourselves out of the mess into a shallow ditch by a hedge. Looking up and clearing my eyes with the back of my hand, I saw a man pinned across the chest by wreckage. His legs were thrashing around as though someone were tickling him. One of the glider pilots was getting him out. How those glider pilots and the 2 signalers on top of the carrier escaped the mass of that hurtling iron carrier, I'll never know, but they did. A doctor came along and dressed Peter and me and helped us to a dressing station. On the way, I saw burning gliders, crashed gliders, and the great courage of men going into fight almost before they'd finished touching down. It was the old story of the men with the maroon berets who never worry about odds. The ground was covered with a mist of smoke from our artillery bombardment, and that was what had made it nearly impossible for the men to find their landing zones and spots. We spent the next 4 hours with that regiment. We had to. When contact was made with the men on our left, we made our painful way through them to Divisional HQ. Here, that remarkable young firebrand, their general, told us that all objectives had been reached and that when the Second Army linked up, he would hand them over in good shape and his job would be done. That has now taken place. One of the happy moments of the day was to see Major Roy Oliver intact at headquarters, and as dark fell, we tried to curl up into the familiar slit trench. All night long, the guns roared behind us, and the planes droned overhead. The enemy counterattacked, but the line held everywhere. And that's how the matter stood as I came away.
Our period of waiting is over. This is the time. In the Buffalo, that strange, all-purpose vehicle which is taking us over the Rhine, I'm crouching with the commanding officer of the assault battalion. And in his Bren gun carrier fills the Buffalo, and on the Bren gun carrier pile his men, tin-hatted, and we're watching, gazing towards that far bank of the Rhine. It's a fantastic sight. We've broken out first through the Bund, the wall that retains the floodwaters of the Rhine, and we're out in the open spaces. Overhead goes an absolute crisscross pattern of our tracers, firing in as fast as they can into the German bank. The thunder of our guns echoing and crashing in our ears. As we waited, we were deafened by the noise and blinded by their flashes. But now we seem alone, out here in the open space, right on the water's edge, waiting for the final signal. The Buffalo, the driver in charge, man of the Royal Tank Regiment, is receiving the signal. The captain's waving to him. And this is where we move. The Buffalo driver gives an extra rev as he feels for the edge of the water. We're guided up right to the very edge by a long little line of small green lights that have been laid to take us to the jumping off ground. A last look back at the shore, we're leaving. The searchlights are playing. Sing one, wave us up, and in it a lone star. And the moonlight filling the sky. But here ahead of us, there's no effect of moonlight at all. We've reached the water's edge, and we see the Rhine, not running as we thought it would, bright under the moon, but running red. Because right on the opposite side of the village, every single house and haystack you can see is burning, beaten down by the fury of our barrage. Slowly, carefully, we come down to the water's edge.
It took us 48 hours to clear the town of Rees. We had an easy crossing and reached the first group of buildings, and there we found that the Boche were determined to hold on to every house, as we had to fight from house to house. For instance, one platoon commander was hit over the head by a Boche sergeant major with his rifle butt, but as he went down, he got him with a Bastogne. We were bazookaed the whole time, sniped and spandowed, and we had to fight our way literally from house to house, right through the town, fighting amongst a lot of rubble. We couldn't get any tanks over, as it was impossible for them to work in the streets, so we got a mountain gun, which did excellent work in blasting the snipers' positions, and so allowing us to get forward. Finally, after fighting for 48 hours, we drove the Boche into one strong point, which was a fort at the far end of the town, and there they held out. We finally took the position, capturing 15 machine guns and about 50 prisoners.
There are only two things that the people in West Holland think about now. One is food, and the other is disgust from the Germans. Since you heard a report on the food situation in Holland 6 weeks ago, the situation has got much worse. It gets worse day by day. I have seen myself both old people and children fall dead in the streets from hunger. The situation is so bad that the underground has to deal with a general apathy caused by exhaustion. So we decided it would be a good thing to publish in Holland a description of the rations supplied to the liberated part of the country, for we believed this would be an encouragement to them. There is no regular government left in occupied Holland. There's only the church and the underground movement. The Germans shoot more and more people as a reprisal, and because they wish to frighten them, but this is not authority, it is violence. The church has been helping both to collect and to distribute food, especially for children, and it has helped to organize the removal of children from the 3 hunger provinces, as we call them. And the underground movement has not ceased to organize resistance to the Germans. Though we have no electricity and cannot listen to the BBC, yet the news is still distributed by the underground press, and every Dutchman gets it. Before I left Holland, I was asked to say one thing to the people outside, to the people in Great Britain, and it was this: the British don't understand the Germans. Both on the ground and in the air you fight them fiercely, but there's some sort of sporting idea about it, which is not our idea of the Germans. The German attitude is that he shoots you and then says, what a pity, it had to be done. This is how we understand the Germans. They are liars and hypocrites. They know that nobody loves them, and they cannot face the fact. So their whole life is untrue. This not only concerns the official Nazis. The falsehood gets right through to the common soldier. In Holland we believe that they are morally obliged to be false and treacherous because in principle they are corrupt. Now just one message to the people of Great Britain. The underground movement in Holland will continue to fight. Things are bad. In fact, they could hardly be worse. But we shall continue to fight for the sake of our children and the future of our country, a once more prosperous Holland living in a world of security and peace.
I was sitting in the kitchen of a small country town hotel. We had come into the German kitchen not to fraternize, that strictly forbidden practice, but because we had seen a large radio set there and wanted to hear the BBC News at 9 o'clock. It took us some time to find London on the dial, and the announcer had already begun the bulletin when we brought his voice loud and clear into the room. The hotel family was already there when we came in. The old white-haired man who watched us fearfully. I think the Germans had told him terrible stories of what we would do. His two not unattractive daughters, by no means frightened, and his grey-haired wife who sat knitting at the table. A woman friend was visiting them, one of the smarter women of the little town, with her hair caught up in a bright turban and wearing what looked to me very like fully fashioned silk stockings. They, at least the women, were ready and anxious to talk, but we made it pretty clear that we had come in only to hear the wireless. As we sat listening to the news about this battle area, I watched the reaction of this German family which had been engulfed in the fighting a very short time before, and could hear it going on now if we turned off the set. They were listening quite intently, understanding no English, but catching the German place names as Freddie Greiswood mentioned them. And as I watched them, a thought struck me. This was a recital from London of our success, of the growing and spreading defeat of their country. And yet there was not one sound or sign of regret on their faces. No shock, no despair, no alarm. They just picked up what was said, checked it on the map, and noted it, just as if they were a bunch of neutrals hearing all about somebody else. And indeed I believe that that's what many of these frontline German people are, neutrals in their own country.
This is the BBC Home Service. Good morning, everybody. Here's the first news for today, Friday the 13th of April, read by Frederick Allen. President Roosevelt, we sincerely regret to announce, died suddenly last night. The tragic news reached this country just before midnight. Mr. Roosevelt died at his cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia, at 10:30 from cerebral hemorrhage. Only a little over 2 hours earlier, he'd been sitting in his armchair while an artist sketched him. He suddenly complained of a very severe headache and in a few minutes lost consciousness. He did not regain consciousness before he died. Mr. Roosevelt was 63 in January. He'd been for 10 days at his Warm Springs cottage, which he'd visited regularly for more than 20 years to take after treatment for the infantile paralysis that attacked him in 1921. Mrs. Roosevelt received the news in Washington and was flown to Warm Springs. As soon as the news was received in London, the King was informed. His Majesty was deeply shocked and expressed his most profound and sincere regret. The news was also given immediately to Mr. Churchill, to whom it came as a complete surprise and great personal shock. When an American president dies in office, he's succeeded by the vice president, and Mr. Harry Truman was therefore sworn in a few hours ago as 33rd President of the United States. He's issued his first statement as president from the White House, and it says that the San Francisco conference will be held as planned. President Truman, who is 60, comes from Missouri. He was elected Democratic senator for that state in 1935 and was re-elected in 1940. As head of the congressional committee named after him, he conducted an investigation into government expenditure during the war until he was invited last year to stand as vice president to President Roosevelt.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Germany. Last Sunday, a train steamed out of Brunswick Station. On board it, there were 4,500 prisoners and foreign workers, Frenchmen, Belgians, Russians, Poles, and even Germans. men and women who had been working as Nazi slaves in the Hermann Goering steelworks near Brunswick. As the Allies drew near, the Germans tried to clear away their human loot, even though most of these 4,500 were starved and sick. Their SS guards told them that they were being taken to another camp, where they were to be gassed and cremated. But they didn't reach that camp. Yesterday in the town of Celle, a Frenchman who was on that train told me what happened to them. On Sunday evening, he said, the train stopped in the station yard at Celle while the engine filled up with water and coal. Our carriages were left standing between an ammunition train and a petrol train, and we hadn't been there long when some Allied bombers came over. When we heard them coming, he said, we tried to get out of the train, but as we jumped down onto the tracks, the SS guards opened fire on us with machine guns. Then the bombs began to fall and they hit the train. The ammunition and the petrol began to explode. Many must have been killed, but those who survived tried to get away from the fire and the explosions. Some of us, he said, reached shelter, but most of the rest were shot down by the SS guards. After it was all over, there were only 200 left out of the 4,500, and we 200 were rounded up by the SS and herded into a stable, a filthy stable, and there we lay on the straw that barely covered the manure underneath. Many of us, he added, were wounded or burnt, but they left us there for 4 days without medical attention, food or water. We were rescued only when the British came. Yesterday, in Celle, I saw most of the 200 survivors. I was taken round a hospital by a British doctor and a captain who were the first to find them. The men I saw were almost skeletons, and the doctor said that he had never seen men in such pitiable condition. They'd been starved for years, until their legs were no thicker than a man's wrist and their bodies were mere skin and bone. They must have been almost as starved as this when they boarded that train, and yet only the day before that, most of them had been slaves in a German factory. They told us how the Nazis had put German criminals in with them to act as spies, and how these criminals had been given the privilege of supervising their work and of beating them on the slightest provocation. One Frenchman, a man who had been captured as a member of the Maquis, told me that when he came he couldn't understand German, but when he didn't obey orders, shouted at him in German, he had been beaten. He and many others said that this was typical. They told us how they'd been forced to work on starvation rations and had been paid 1 mark a week, and a mark is worth 6pence. All we could buy with that, said one Frenchman, was food that we give only to pigs. When these men were rescued by our troops, they were too weak to move. They had to be carried on stretchers to German hospitals in the town. But our troops saw to it that these stretchers were carried by German civilians and were carried through the streets so that the German people could see what their fellow Germans had done. Yesterday afternoon, the doctor and the captain who had rescued them were continuing this German education. With them, I visited one of the hospitals. There were 4 Germans with us, too. One, the local schoolmaster, who'd been an ardent Nazi. Another, a man you might call a German country squire, who spoke perfect English. And 2 others, a man and his daughter, who were members of the old Junkers von Moltke family. Their reactions were interesting. The little Nazi schoolmaster tried to plead justification. These men were criminals, he said. We didn't treat all our foreign workers like this. Most of them were glad to come. Yes, said the squire, and those who worked on our farms were well treated and had plenty to eat. The German people looked after the foreign workers. It is only the SS who have done this kind of thing. The von Moltkes also blamed the SS and the party, but they could see no connection between this and the support their military class had given to the Nazis. Even confronted with this evidence, they could not see or admit Germany's guilt.
Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which, except perhaps by a convulsive movement or the last quiver of a sigh from a living skeleton too weak to move. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. There was no privacy, nor did men or women ask it any longer. Women stood and squatted, stark naked in the dust, trying to wash themselves and to catch the lice on their bodies. Babies had been born here, tiny, wizened things that could not live. A mother, driven mad, screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust the tiny mite into his arms and ran off, crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found the baby had been dead for days. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life.
We saw the heavies leave the target area safely and then dived pretty low to make a sweep around the outskirts of Berlin. While we were still flying in towards the German capital, someone reported aircraft on our port side. It looked as if we'd run into some trouble, and at once the whole wing changed course and headed flat out in the direction of the reported aircraft. It was rather hazy, and for some time I couldn't see anything. Then quite suddenly I spotted some aircraft almost dead ahead. There seemed to be quite a number of them, and they were flying in wide formation. Suddenly someone called out, "They're Russians." But we were still not sure and closed in towards them very cautiously. They'd obviously spotted us and seemed a bit wary too. And what seemed to me to be escorting fighters began to weave and do some tight turns. They were pretty maneuverable. Then, all at once, we were on top of the aircraft and saw that they were some of the Russian Air Force's famous Stormovik bombers escorted by Yak fighters. Recognition was mutual. At once we exchanged friendly signals and waved our arms in greeting to the Red pilots who waggled the wings of their planes. As we shot by, we could see the Red Star of Russia on their wings and fuselage. And so, over the outskirts of Berlin, we met our Russian allies for the first time. But at the time, we didn't have much opportunity to think of the significance of this. For only a few minutes later, we were all chasing a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s. 6 went down in flames almost on their own airfields, and several more were hit and went down out of control.
While the tanks of a task force of the US 69th Division were blasting the walls of Leipzig Town Hall, those same walls held a grim and macabre secret. I had been on a preliminary search in the rooms of the Rathaus, accompanied by 3 American soldiers with their guns at the ready, because we were the first people to look into these rooms. Some of them were badly shattered by shell fire from the American tanks. Others were in almost perfect order. Nearly all the doors were open, but we came upon 2 that were locked. I thought little of it at the time. Then Harold Denny of the New York Times, with whom I'd been captured in Africa and who I've just run into again with the 1st U.S. Army, suggested that we look at a large house next to the Rathaus. We went downstairs into the air raid shelter. There we found a group of German civilians. I questioned them. They told me they were all the staff of the Rathaus restaurant. I asked them what had happened to the Oberbürgermeister, the Lord Mayor, for we had heard a rumor that he had committed suicide. They confirmed the rumor. Then a man stepped forward and told me that he was the caretaker of the Rathaus. I asked him where the Oberbürgermeister's office was. He told me the number. He said he would come across and show me. We went back to the Rathaus. We climbed the stairs and went into a room. This, he explained, was not the Oberbürgermeister's office, but his conference room. Sprawled across a table, his head in a pool of blood, was a Volkssturm man. A Tommy gun lay beside him. So did a bottle of French brandy and a half-empty glass. Another Volkssturm man lay dead on the floor. In another corner, another, who had also committed suicide, stared at us with glassy eyes. A large picture of Hitler looked down upon this grisly spectacle. Our German guide displayed no emotion at this sight. He merely said, "Now I shall take you to the Oberbürgermeister's office." We climbed another flight of stairs and stopped at a door which I remembered was one which we had found locked. The caretaker fumbled in his pocket and brought out a bunch of keys. By an amazing stroke of luck, I had stumbled upon the one man among the 750,000 of Leipzig's inhabitants who had all the keys of the Rathaus. He opened the door. The first sight which met my eyes was another dead Volkssturm man lying on the floor. Banknotes of 20 and 50 mark denominations were scattered all over the floor. An empty phial lying on the table showed that this suicide had chosen poison as the way out. There were 2 doors leading from this anteroom. My guide pointed to the left one. That is the Oberbürgermeister's office, he said. I ordered him to open the door. As he did so, I shouted in German, "Is there anyone there?" There was no reply. But there were 3 people there, all the same. Seated at his desk at the far end of the luxuriously furnished, oak-paneled room was the Oberbürgermeister, Dr. Freiberg. His hands were on the table. His shaven, typically German head was slightly tilted back. He was stone dead. A book of Schiller's poetry lay by his right hand. Opposite him was a small, middle-aged woman leaning back in an armchair. She, too, was dead. Beside her was a typical flaxen-haired German girl with spectacles, his daughter. She, too, was dead. I cannot express the impression which this terrible, macabre spectacle produced on me. It was ghastly, uncanny. On the desk lay another of the same files. There was no label on it, but it had done its work only too well. The Oberbürgermeister had wanted to declare Leipzig an open city. He had wanted to avoid slaughter. He knew half-trained Volkssturm men would not be able to stop the inevitable fall of his city. Although he was a Nazi, he was wearing the party badge in his buttonhole, and although he had held office for some 9 years, he knew he was in disgrace, for Himmler had sent orders which superseded his own. So he had chosen this way out, and not only for himself, but for his wife and daughter. As I looked in horror at this scene, the telephone on the Oberbürgermeister's desk rang. Automatically, I picked up the receiver. A woman's voice asked, "Is that the Rathaus?" "Yes," I said. "What do you want?" She must have realized that something was wrong, for she immediately rang off.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news, read by Frederick Grieswood. We begin by taking listeners over direct to one of our transmitters in Germany, where Frank Gillard is waiting to speak.
This is Frank Gillard at General Bradley's headquarters. East and West have met. At 20 minutes to 5 on Wednesday afternoon, April the 25th, 1945, American troops of General Bradley's 12th Army Group made contact with Soviet elements of Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Army Group near the German town of Torgau on the Elbe. This is the news for which the whole Allied world has been waiting. Nazi Germany, tottering to her final collapse, has been split clean in half. The forces of liberation have joined hands. The junction was made by a small patrol from the American First Army, 1 lieutenant and 3 men from the 273rd Regiment of the 69th United States Infantry Division. They were on a reconnaissance into the no-man's land beyond that sector of the Mulda River which their division was holding. Somewhere out there ahead of them they knew were the Russians. Nobody was quite certain where. But before their afternoon's work was done, these 4 Americans made history. They reached the Russian lines and made contact with a forward unit of the 173rd Regiment of the 58th Russian Guards Division.
Hello, BBC. Hello, BBC. This is Edward Ward speaking from Corps Headquarters of the Russian Red Army on the east bank of the Elbe. You can hear this music. This is the Red Orchestra playing. We've got some dancing here. The Russian dancer is dancing around. We've just had a very, very big lunch with the Red Army. As I said, we've just had a very great lunch from the Red Army. We've joined up with them today. General Hodges and the Russian general have given very big speeches, and we're all here, and everything is beautiful.
Like we've all by now learned what the target is, and the fact that it's very, very small indeed. Your particular aiming point, the attack, is the house where this gentleman's supposed to live. Whether he's there is another matter. But no doubt there will be plenty of people there who can benefit from it. So I'll just run through briefly the plan of attack before we go on to any other main points.
Hello BBC, this is Brian Bliss with Bomber Command. It's 0 hour, the attack is on. And the 1st Lancaster swinging into position at the head of the runway right opposite me now. Here she comes. Remember, this is the squadron which sank the Tirpitz, and now they're off for Berchtesgaden with 12,000 pounders. 12,000 pounders, and they're taking the attack literally to Hitler's doorstep. Well, here comes the Lancaster now. It's a really clear evening, a lovely evening. We can see her shape silhouetted against the evening sky. Here she is, A. Abel, right opposite me now. Engines turning over, ready for the takeoff for Berchtesgaden. And there she goes. Everyone here is waving. And A. Abel is off. And here she comes, a marvelous sight as she races by.
I saw a 12,000-pounder land about 100 yards from Hitler's house. There was a terrific flash, and even though we were flying pretty high, we could hear the explosion above the roar of our 4 engines, and the whole plane seemed to rock. Great piles of earth came shooting up high into the sky. I thought to myself, well, even if that's a bit short, it must have damaged the place. But just at that moment, there was another flash, followed by a huge explosion. One of the other aircraft had planted its 12,000-pounder bang on the target.
Soon after 8, we reached the Bavarian Alps, and everyone did a final check on their equipment. There were to be no mistakes on this attack. Well, we got there bang on time, and the Hun started to fire at us in real anger. The flak was pretty accurate, although not quite as much of it as we expected. As the leader of my formation, I was not able to observe immediate results. But as we turned for home, the entire target area was covered by smoke and dust, with the biggest cloud of all draped over the Hitler hideout.
From a bomb aimer's point of view, the target was hard to identify. It rests in a valley, and early this morning we approached it over a hill which rises 3,000 feet above the target area. However, we were lucky enough to come over the hill almost dead ahead of the house. I had a perfect run-up and released my 12,000-pound bomb with the house dead in the sight. I did not have the pleasure of seeing the bomb explode because it was delayed action. After bombing, we circled the target area, and I saw several bombs go down right on the SS barracks, which are next to the house.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news, read by Alva Liddell. Marshal Stalin has announced that Russian armies now surround Berlin, and the Germans say Hitler is still inside the city. Late news still coming in from Moscow is that Soviet troops are still closing in towards the center of Berlin, that on the Dresden front they've forced the River Elbe, and that the French statesman Monsieur Herriot has been freed from a prison camp. Marshal Stalin has also announced that in the north, the East Prussian port of Pillau has fallen. From the west, Third Army spearheads have got to within 16 miles of the Austrian frontier. Other American and French columns are driving towards the Bavarian redoubt and are threatening Munich. British troops are inside Bremen's city boundaries. 350 Lancasters bombed Hitler's Berchtesgaden retreat and other targets in the area this morning. American heavies have been to the same district. Another special communiqué from Italy tonight reports a rapid expansion of the Allied drive beyond the Po. There are signs that the Germans are on the run.
We are into the center of the city of Bremen, if you can call this chaotic rubbish heap, in which our bulldozers are working as I speak, their men with handkerchiefs around their throat to avoid the flying dust. If you can call this rubbish heap a city anymore. When we came in this morning, we had a look at our city maps. They've been marked for the areas the Air Force regarded as devastated, and the percentage of devastation was added. But looking around us now, I can tell you that
Well, it's almost a waste of time to add those percentages. There are walls standing, there are factory chimneys here and there, but there's no shape and no order, and certainly no hope for this shell of a city that was once called Bremen. It's the sheer size of the smashed area that overwhelms you. These endless vistas down small streets with the houses leaning at drunken angles, and this inhuman landscape of great blocks of flats with their sides ripped open, and the intimate household goods just spilled out into the bomb craters. We rather expected it when we came in, but again, it's the scale that counts. Bremen, by the look of it, was a city of about, say, 300,000 inhabitants. But once you're past the outer suburbs, there's hardly a house intact in which these people could live. Of course, they haven't even tried to live in them. Everybody has gone into those giant air raid shelters, these great blocks of almost solid concrete that are dotted all over the ruins of Bremen. They've stood up to the bombing well, and now from the one opposite us, the people are coming out to stare at the tanks and the bulldozers and at the guns now rolling past us into the heart of the city. Some of these people are already starting to potter about in that seemingly aimless way that bombed out people do among the dusty rubble. They're pulling out odd bits of furniture, just something to patch up the few rooms in the ground floor that have occasionally remained intact in these ruined streets. And overall, there's an almost summer sun blazing down on this tumbled desert of brick and rubble that once was Bremen.
Today, many Soviet flags are flying in Berlin, notably on the Reichstag building, where the Red Army's banner of victory was hoisted yesterday afternoon. Pressing down towards the Tiergarten from the north, Marshal Zhukov's troops have also captured the Ministry of the Interior, which, like the Reichstag, stands very near the Unter den Linden. Other Soviet troops have also driven almost to the center of the city from the east. The German High Command communique, still issued nominally from Hitler's headquarters, opened this afternoon with these words: "In the heart of Berlin, the gallant garrison, closely gathered around the Führer, is defending itself in a reduced space against the superior Bolsheviks." That's the first time during the crisis, and probably the first time ever, that the Nazis have put Hitler into one of his own communiques. They go on to speak about the heroic struggle continuing under extremely heavy artillery fire and waves of attack from the air. There's no more talk of forces coming with relief from outside, so it looks as if the Nazis are preparing to write off both their Führer and their capital.
Auf dem Führerhauptquartier wird gemeldet, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler heute Nachmittag in seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge gegen den Bolschewismus kämpfend für Deutschland gefallen ist. Am 30. April hat der Führer den Großadmiral Dönitz zu seinem Nachfolger ernannt. Der Großadmiral und Nachfolger des Führers spricht zum deutschen Volk. Deutsche Männer und Frauen, Soldaten der deutschen Wehrmacht. Unser Führer Adolf Hitler ist gefallen. In tiefster Trauer und Ehrfurcht verneigt sich das deutsche Volk. Frühzeitig hatte er die furchtbare Gefahr des Bolschewismus erkannt und diesem Ringen sein Dasein geweiht. Am Ende dieses seines Kampfes und seines unbeirrbaren, geraden Lebensweges steht sein Heldentod in der Hauptstadt des Deutschen Reiches. Sein Leben war ein einziger Dienst für Deutschland. Sein Einsatz im Kampf gegen die bolschewistische Sturmflut galt darüber hinaus Europa der gesamten Kulturwelt. Der Führer hat mich zu seinem Nachfolger bestimmt. Im Bewusstsein der Verantwortung übernehme ich die Führung des deutschen Volkes in dieser schicksalsschweren Stunde. Meine erste Aufgabe ist es, deutsche Menschen vor der Vernichtung durch den vordrängenden bolschewistischen Feind zu retten. Nur für dieses Ziel geht der militärische Kampf weiter. Soweit und solange die Erreichung dieses Zieles durch die Briten und Amerikaner behindert wird, werden wir uns auch gegen sie weiter verteidigen und weiter kämpfen müssen. Die Angloamerikaner setzen dann den Krieg nicht mehr für ihre eigenen Völker, sondern allein für die Ausbreitung des Bolschewismus in Europa fort. Was das deutsche Volk in dem Ringen dieses Krieges kämpfend vollbracht und in der Heimat ertragen hat, ist geschichtlich einmalig. In der kommenden Notzeit unseres Volkes werde ich bestrebt sein, unseren tapferen Frauen, Männern und Kindern, soweit dies in meiner Macht steht, erträgliche Lebensbedingungen zu schaffen. Daher brauche ich eure Hilfe. Schenkt mir euer Vertrauen. Und euer Recht verteidigt. Lasst Ordnung und Disziplin Stadt und Land aufrecht. Tue jeder an seiner Stelle seine Pflicht. Nur so werden wir die Leiden, die die kommende Zeit jedem Einzelnen von uns bringen wird, mildern und den Zusammenbruch verhindern können. Wenn wir tun, was in unseren Kräften steht, wird auch der Herrgott nach so viel Leid und Opfer uns nicht verlassen.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Hello, BBC. This is Winford Vaughan Thomas reporting to you from Germany. When I heard the news of Hitler's death, I went out and I talked to the British Tommies. They didn't listen to the German radio. None of the lads I talked to spoke German. The streets of this little town from which I'm now speaking are still without light. The front is not so very far away, and the men were sitting by candlelight doing what most soldiers do in Germany at evenings when they're out of the line, having a brew-up of tea and writing home. I told them the news, and how do they feel about it? Here's their spokesman, Private William Townsend. He's in the South Wales Borderers. He has, thanks to Hitler, now had to spend 6 years of his life fighting the Germans. He's fought them in Norway, which was among the first of Hitler's victims. He landed in Normandy on D-Day, when the walls of Hitler's fortress were first smashed. He was wounded in that assault. But now, he and hundreds of thousands of British soldiers like him are in the heart of Germany when they heard the news of the Führer's death. What were your first feelings about it, Private Townsend?
Well, it won't be long now.
They announced that Hitler died with his troops defending his chancellery. Is that the way you wanted him to die?
No, we all feel cheated about it. We'd rather him see him die like a common murderer. I think he got off light.
Do you think this means the end of the war?
Well, Hitler is dead, yes. But the boys are still fighting fanatical Germans. I'll do my celebrating when I hear Germany has surrendered.
And what do you want for that celebration?
Just home. That goes for every soldier.
There were many of us in this town who were never members of the Nazi Party. I was the only male teacher in the school here who did not belong to it. I am telling you the truth tonight when I say that the news that Hitler is dead makes us feel that we are released. We did not know until we were shown it how many crimes had been committed near this town, how many people had been killed. Although I was a teacher here during the Nazi regime, I did not accept Hitler's doctrines. I was teaching English and French, so my textbooks were not so affected as much as many others. But they did contain special passages for translation which were directed against England. Some were by Irish and Indian authors, describing what they called British cruelties in those countries. I had to use those books, and I also had to teach the children that the Jews were a poor people. But I left out the chapter called The Jewish Question, which was all about them. And when we had been dealing with the anti-British questions, I used to say to the boys and girls, "You must remember that we are at war, so you know why these passages were chosen." There used to be many smiles. I tell you this because I cannot deny that I had to use the Nazi textbooks in teaching the children, and that I had to follow the general lines of the Nazi doctrine. But all the time I knew that Hitler would lead us into war. And at the time of Stalingrad and El Alamein, we all knew that we had reached the turning point of the war and that Germany would be defeated. There will be many people in this town who will be thankful to hear that Hitler is dead. We know that it is useless to resist any further. Perhaps there will be more talk of some secret weapon that will save us, but we know those things are nonsense. This has been a very hard lesson for Germany. Now we must make peace at once and start afresh. When I told my wife tonight that Hitler was dead, she said, "God be thanked." That is what I and many more like me say tonight.
Now we're breaking into our programs for the second time tonight, this time with some splendid news from Moscow. Berlin has fallen. Marshal Stalin has just announced the complete capture of the capital of Germany, the center of German imperialism, and the cradle of German aggression. The Berlin garrison laid down their arms this afternoon. More than 70,000 prisoners have been rounded up so far today.
I'm standing in the little village of Lauenburg, and I'm watching the sight that we'd hoped we'd see for 6 long years. The German army coming into surrender, driving into surrender on its own petrol with its own drivers into the British lines. Since 2 o'clock this morning, this endless stream of transport has been pouring through this town, under the white flags hung over the shattered houses by the inhabitants. We're standing in the streets looking dumbfounded at this wreckage of the Wehrmacht that's going past us. But make no mistake about it, this army we see going by us is the most curious collection of wreckage you ever saw. Improvised cars with people lighting on the bumpers, half-track vehicles, thousands of them going through in a steady stream. To make matters even more fantastic, they've got their own traffic policemen directing them under British orders, standing on the corner waving listlessly on as the thing goes steadily by us. These people are defeated soldiers. You can see it in their eyes. In the middle of them, there comes a much more joyous note. We've seen a charabanc full of RAF released prisoners cheering as they went by, and the Germans on the half-track looking glumly on. And what do the British soldiers who've been watching it think about it?
Well, so we've been waiting 6 long years for this. What a sight. My boy, I'd never seen nothing like it.
On this day of victory in Europe, I feel I would like to speak to all who have served and fought with me during the last few years. What I have to say is very simple and quite short. I would ask you all to remember those of our comrades who fell in the struggle. They gave their lives that others might have freedom, and no man can do more than that. I believe that he would say to each one of them, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." And we who remain have seen the thing through to the end. We all have a feeling of great joy and thankfulness that we have been preserved to see this day. We must remember to give the praise and thankfulness where it is due. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. In the early days of this war, the British Empire stood alone against the combined might of the Axis powers, and during those days we suffered some great disasters. but we stood firm, on the defensive, but striking blows where we could. Later, we were joined by Russia and America, and from then onwards, the end was in no doubt. Let us never forget what we owe to our Russian and American allies. This great Allied team has achieved much in war, may it achieve even more in peace. Without doubt, great problems lie ahead. The world will not recover quickly from the upheaval that has taken place. There is much work for each one of us. I would say that we must face up to that work with the same fortitude that we faced up to the worst days of this war. It may be that some difficult times lie ahead for our country, and for each one of us personally. If it happens thus, then our discipline will pull us through. But we must remember that the best discipline implies the subordination of self for the benefit of the community. It has been a privilege and an honor to command this great British Empire team in Western Europe. Few commanders can have had such loyal service as you have given me. I thank each one of you from the bottom of my heart. And so, let us embark on what lies ahead, full of joy and optimism. We have won the German war. Let us now win the peace. Good luck to you all, wherever you may be.
We have come far, we Allies, since the 6th day of June in 1944, when we battered our way ashore on the Norman beaches. During those first bitter months in Normandy, when the 1st United States Army fought beside its comrades in arms in the 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd British Army, the Germans learned how furiously we could fight. It was on August the 1st, just after the breakout from St. Lo, that our American forces were divided into two armies, the 1st and 3rd, under the command of the 12th Army Group, to be joined in September by the 9th Army and later by the 15th. You will remember the events that followed as we played our part in this great campaign. The Argenton-Falais pocket, the sweep across France, the flight of the enemy back to the shelter of his Siegfried Line, the winter battle in the Ardennes. Then the final smashing of the Siegfried Line, the crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr, culminating on April the 25th when we joined forces with the Russians on the banks of the Elbe. A chronicle, indeed, of great and historic events. And now we have reached the end of our journey. I want to commend every man and officer in this group of armies I have been privileged to command. Let me say of them, with great pride, that no better troops have ever fought, anywhere, at any time, under any flag. Troops like these, matched by the fighting fury of their brothers in arms of the 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Montgomery and the 6th Army Group under General Devers, have won a war together. Germany is now beaten, completely and thoroughly beaten. There can be no doubt in the minds of the German people that they have failed miserably in their desire to force their will and their treachery on the rest of the world. Let us now turn our entire effort to the complete and unconditional defeat of Japan with the same determination and persistence we have shown here. And finally, let us win the peace in such a way that our children will not have to fight another war more terrible than this.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Lüneburg, where Himmler committed suicide last night. One of the men with him in the room at the time, at 31 Ulsener Strasse, was Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of Mortlake in Surrey. And I've brought him to the microphone to tell you what happened. Sergeant Major Austin.
Before I arrived, I didn't know it was Himmler. I was only told there was an important prisoner whom I was to guard. As he came into the room, not the arrogant figure which we all know, but dressed in an army shirt, a pair of underpants, with a blanket wrapped round him, I immediately recognized him as Himmler. Speaking to him in German, and pointing to an empty couch, I said, "That's your bed. Get undressed." He looked at me and then looked at an interpreter and said, he doesn't know who I am. I said, yes, I do. You're Himmler. But still, that's your bed. Get undressed. He tried to stare me out, but I stared at him back. And eventually he dropped his eyes and sat down on the bed and started to take off his underpants. The doctor and the colonel then came into the room and started to carry out a routine inspection, looking for poison, which we suspected he probably had on him. He looked at between his toes, all over his body, under his armpits, in his ears, behind his ears, in his hair, and then he came to his mouth. He asked Himmler to open his mouth. He did, and he ran his tongue around his lips quite easily, but the doctor wasn't satisfied. He asked him to come nearer to the light. He came nearer to the light and opened his mouth. The doctor tried to put 2 fingers into his mouth to have a good look inside, I suspected. And Himmler drew his head away and, clamping down on the doctor's fingers, crushed the phial of poison which he had been carrying in his mouth for hours. The doctor said, he's done it. And the colonel and I instinctively jumped to him. The doctor held him by the throat as he was falling and tried to make him spit out the poison which he was swallowing, and the colonel and I held him. After a struggle lasting a quarter of an hour, in which we tried all methods of artificial respiration under the direction of the doctor, he died. And when he died, we threw a blanket over him and left him.
I saw the end of the 3rd German Reich today. It was like the last convulsions of a snake whose head has been chopped off, but which still squirms desperately. The pieces were still moving at the little German port of Flensburg until 10 o'clock this morning, when Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz and Colonel General Gustav Jodl were placed under arrest and flown to an undisclosed European airport. The German state was completely dismembered today and deprived of a central government for the first time since Bismarck, in a simple but very effective ceremony in the bar of the Hamburg America liner Patria off Flensburg. The German High Command was given no warning. Admiral Dönitz and General Jodl had simply been told to present themselves at the ship at 9:45 this morning. I stayed on the ship all night to watch their arrival. They came promptly enough and strode from the German cars with energy and dignity, still believing that we would allow them to administer Germany because they had warned us that without their direction the Western Reich would be swept by communism. But as soon as Admiral Dönitz noticed the Russian staff officers aboard ship and took in the general air of expectancy, he turned to Jodl, and I heard him say, "It's clear what's going to happen now." We made him and his party wait in the ship's bar, fidgeting and wondering about their fate before the American, British, and Russian generals arrived. We had found the German general staff a certain amount of use. They had helped in the disarming and withdrawal of German troops from Denmark and Norway, and we had gathered information of some value. For instance, Jodl had confessed that the German general staff had actually ordered an invasion of England beginning July 2nd, 1940, but this was called off on October 22nd without any real attempt to land, although a German battalion had been caught in a barge exercise by the RAF. But today was the end of Nazi government. Ashen white, Dönitz heard Major General Lowell Rooks tell him that he and his entire government were under arrest. I watched General Jodl's face blotch red and his nose get redder and redder. Then America's General Rooks told Dönitz, "Have you anything to say?" In a quavering voice that gradually became firmer, Dönitz replied, "Any word would be superfluous." And so Hitler's ill-fated successor shuffled off the ship after ruling Germany for 23 of her most disastrous days.